Silence swallowed the underground poker room like the lid of a coffin being sealed. The slap still hung in the air, a sound like a blade cutting through everything that had come before it. 30 men froze mid-breath, mid-card deal, mid-sip of whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The green felt table stretched into shadows thick with cigar smoke, the kind of smoke that clung to skin and fabric and memory. Above ground, a blizzard howled through San Francisco's streets, wind screaming like something wounded, snow piling against the windows of the city's glittering towers. But down here, in this basement carved beneath a building no one could find unless they already knew where to look, the temperature was 10 degrees too hot and getting hotter. Mia Morales stood with her palm still stinging, her entire body trembling like a candle in the wind. The enforcer she had struck, 6'2", muscular, cold-eyed, dressed in a suit that cost more than everything she owned combined, staggered backward. His hand moved toward his holster. Toward the gun. Toward something that would solve this moment the way men like him solved all problems. And then everything stopped. From a back corner booth shrouded in shadow, a man straightened in his chair. Luca Calabrese. 34 years old but carved from something older, something harder. Dark hair slicked back from a face that looked like it had been drawn by someone who understood power and cruelty in equal measure. A scar ran from the edge of his left eye down to his jawline, silvery white against olive skin. His shirt hung open at the collar, exposing the upper edge of his chest, a gold chain catching the amber light from the single lamp hanging above his table. Around his wrists, rings. On his watch, a price tag that would have bought Mia a year of safety. He had been watching her the entire time. And when his eyes moved from her face to the enforcer's hand hovering near his gun, something cold and dangerous stirred in his chest. The enforcer froze. Every man in the room froze. Because everyone in this basement knew what that moment meant. When Luca Calabrese straightened in his chair, when his eyes locked onto someone, mercy had already left the room. Mia had no idea who was watching. She had no idea that the man in the shadows owned this building, these tables, these guns, half the visible power structure of San Francisco's underworld. She had no idea that the cigarette smoke curling from his fingers represented millions of dollars in territory and influence and the kind of control that made city councilmen answer their phones at 3 in the morning. She only knew that an old man was being threatened. That his eviction notice, red ink stamped across the bottom like a death sentence, 12 days until he lost his home, was being used as a joke. That the 3 armed men surrounding him were laughing. She had $5 left in her wallet. $5. Everything else had gone toward a motel room she could no longer afford, food she had not been able to eat, the desperate mathematics of trying to stay alive in a city that had decided she was worth nothing. The old man's name was Arthur Chen. 73 years old, trembling hands, a coat patched at the elbows. He had been trying to find his daughter since Thursday. No one had seen her. No one had helped. And these men had cornered him at this poker table 2 hours ago, offering him a deal, give them information about the restaurant where his daughter worked, or watch his apartment become someone else's property. Mia had been working the back of the poker room since midnight, refilling water glasses and clearing empty bottles, invisible as a ghost. That was her skill. That was what her life had taught her to do. Be present but unnoticed. Exist without taking up space. But something in Arthur Chen's trembling had reached into her chest and grabbed hold. The lead enforcer's name was Vincent. He had worked for Luca for 6 years. He had broken fingers and arms and things that could not be spoken about in polite company. His hand was still moving toward his holster when Mia stepped between them. Her palm connected with his face at an angle that surprised both of them, a full-force slap that used everything her shoulders had, everything her small frame could generate. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the basement. Like a prayer. Like a curse that could not be erased. Cards dropped. Whiskey glasses froze mid-journey. The man dealing blackjack at the nearest table lifted his hands away from the deck like it might explode. And Mia, breathing hard, trembling, her hand burning with impact, met Vincent's eyes. If you hurt him, I will make sure every person in this city knows what you did. I do not have much. But I have nothing left to lose. It was not true. She had Arthur Chen to lose. She had whatever remained of her dignity to lose. She had her life, which was worth very little, but it was still more than the zero she might have after this moment. Vincent's hand went to his gun anyway. His fingers wrapped around the grip. The metal was warm from body heat. The motion was practiced, automatic, the kind of thing a man did when someone had just struck him in front of an audience that mattered. That was when Luca Calabrese stood up. He did not move quickly. He did not shout or gesture or do any of the things men do when they want to display power. He simply stood, and every sound in the room contracted into a single point of silence. The breathing of 30 men became audible. The hum of the neon beer sign in the corner became deafening. The wind outside against the frosted basement window sounded like fingernails scraping against glass. Luca walked toward them. His footsteps were measured, unhurried, each step landing like a decision that could not be undone. The ring on his middle finger caught the light with each step, a massive silver thing with a stone the color of old blood. He stopped 3 feet from Vincent. He did not look at Mia. He only looked at the enforcer, and his voice came out like something carved from stone. The woman asked you a question. Vincent's hand trembled. Not from fear. From the knowledge of what happened to men who disobeyed. Boss, she did not ask for your explanation. She asked for her answer. Luca's eyes were the color of storm clouds before lightning. They held no mercy. They held no compromise. They held only the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you are willing to do to anyone who tests you. Vincent's hand came away from his gun. It fell to his side like it had been severed from his wrist. Luca turned to Mia. He looked at her for the first time, really looked at her, and something shifted in his face that none of his men had ever seen before. Her hands were shaking. Her uniform, the black vest over a white button-down shirt that had come untucked in the back, was wrinkled from 12 hours of work. Her dark hair had come loose from its ponytail. There was a bruise on her left cheekbone in the shape of someone's knuckles. Her eyes, though. Her eyes burned like nothing he had seen in a very long time. You can take the old man, Luca said. You can take him to safety. You can take him to find his daughter. When you find her, you tell her that anyone who touches Arthur Chen touches me. He paused. Around them, 30 men held their breath. And tell them what I do to people who touch me. Mia nodded. She could not speak. Every muscle in her body was locked tight, vibrating at a frequency that only dogs could hear. She reached for Arthur Chen's arm. He rose from his chair, still trembling, and together they moved toward the stairs leading up and out of this basement and back into a world where the rules were different. Where invisible people remained invisible. Where old men could be threatened and no one would intervene. But that was before. That was before the blizzard, before the moment, before everything changed in the span of a single breath. What she did not know, what Arthur Chen did not know, was that Luca Calabrese had not let anyone walk away from him in 8 years. That his men were exchanging glances of confusion. That Bruno, his oldest lieutenant, was thinking something had shifted in the center of their world. What she did not know was that in 3 hours, federal agents would arrive at this location. That her defiance had already set something in motion. That sometimes one hand reached out at the right moment could change an entire life. But first, the story had to rewind. First, we had to understand how Mia Morales, a woman with nothing, had found herself in a basement beneath San Francisco's underground, facing down armed men with nothing but courage and $5 to her name. 3 days earlier. The clock on the wall of the 24-hour diner showed for 24 in the morning. The kind of morning where darkness was so complete it felt permanent, like the sun had decided to stop coming up. Like the world had ended and no one had bothered to tell the remaining survivors. Mia Morales sat in the employee bathroom of Chen's Lucky Garden restaurant, counting the money in her wallet with the precision of someone who understood that mathematics were the only thing standing between her and absolute dissolution. $1 bill. 2. 3. She laid them out on the cracked porcelain sink. 4. $5 total. She had 7 days to come up with $35,000. The eviction notice was taped to the mirror, red ink stamped across the bottom, the kind of notice that made the world get very small and very loud all at once. The apartment where she and Emma had been living was gone. The landlord had given her until the end of the month. But it was the 24th already. That meant 7 days. 7 days to find a place that would take someone with no credit, no references, no history of anything except failure. She was 29 years old, but the woman looking back at her from the mirror looked 40. Dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep could fix, and sleep was a luxury anyway, something rich people had. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that did nothing to hide the shape of her face, all sharp angles where there used to be softness. The bruise on her left cheekbone had turned a shade of purple that matched the walls of the bathroom. That one came from Douglas Hale, the manager of Chen's Lucky Garden. He had done it in the storage room 3 hours ago when she had asked about the tips he had stolen from her shift. She had worked double shifts for 6 days straight. 18 hours of standing, carrying plates, smiling at customers, pretending to be less than human so they would feel bigger. The register had shown she should have made $187 in tips. Douglas had given her nothing. When she asked, he had laughed. When she asked again, he had done this. Mia touched the bruise with her fingertips. It throbbed like a second heartbeat. The bathroom door opened without knocking. Margaret Harrington stood in the doorway, a woman in her late 50s with a kind of expensive face that came from surgeons and skincare products that cost more per ounce than gold. She was the owner's sister, which meant she had authority to do whatever she wanted and no accountability for any of it. Her cream-colored coat was draped over one arm, cashmere, the kind that felt like touching something already dead. "What are you doing in here?" Margaret's voice was the kind of sharp that could draw blood without ever raising in volume. "You should be on the floor. Table 12 is waiting for their coffee." "I was just." "I do not care what you were doing. Out. Now." Margaret did not look at the money on the sink. Did not acknowledge the tears on Mia's face. That was the particular cruelty of people like Margaret. They were professional enough to pretend not to see human suffering, skilled enough to act as though poverty was invisible, as though broken women simply did not exist in their field of vision. Mia swept the $5 back into her wallet. She looked at her reflection one more time and did what she had learned to do 8 years ago, back when the bruises started. She made her face smooth. She made her eyes empty. She became the kind of person no one would notice. She went back to the floor. Table 12 did not want coffee. Table 12 was Margaret's friends, wealthy women with designer handbags and the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having been told no. One of them snapped her fingers at Mia. Actually snapped, like Mia was a dog trained to respond to hand signals. "Water. Ice. Fresh lemon. And make sure the ice is clean this time. Last week I am certain I tasted mold." Mia nodded. She went to get the water. Behind her, she heard laughter. The kind of laughter that was directed at something, at someone, at her. Through the diner's window, beyond the sleeping city, dawn had not yet broken. The darkness continued its work, pressing down on everything, making everything smaller, making everything less. The fluorescent lights of the gas station bathroom buzzed overhead like trapped insects. Mia Morales stood at the sink, her reflection staring back, hollow eyes, collarbones sharp as coat hangers, skin stretched thin over a face that had forgotten how to smile. She was 29 years old but looked 40. The water ran cold. She splashed it on her face, watching the droplets trace paths down to her neck, and thought about the eviction notice folded in her backpack. 12 days. That was all the red ink at the bottom said. 12 days before the landlord changed the locks and everything she owned, the sleeping bag, the 2 uniforms, the photograph of her mother, ended up in a dumpster behind the building. Her hands were shaking as she dried them on a paper towel that disintegrated into wet pulp. That was $5 in her wallet. Not $5 to last a week. $5 total. $5 until her next shift at Sterling's Fine Dining, and even then, Douglas Hale would find a reason to dock her pay. He always did. She changed into her waitress uniform in the bathroom stall, black slacks with a stain near the hem that no amount of scrubbing would remove, a white button-up shirt frayed at the cuffs, and a black vest that hung loose because she'd lost 15 pounds since August. The mirror above the sink was cracked in the corner, and her face split into 3 pieces when she looked at it. She looked away. The drive to Sterling's took 12 minutes through the early morning darkness. Her Honda Civic, 2003, transmission making a grinding sound that meant it was dying, cut through empty streets still sleeping under November clouds. Rain began to fall as she drove, not gentle rain but aggressive rain, the kind that hit the windshield like accusations. Her wipers squeaked. The passenger seat held a blanket and a pillow she would use later, after her shift, when she parked 2 blocks away in the lot behind the closed pharmacy and tried to sleep sitting upright. Sterling's Fine Dining sat on a corner in Pacific Heights, all glass and steel and pretension. The parking lot was empty except for the manager's car, Douglas Hale's Lexus, gleaming black, parked in the spot that said reserved for management. She parked 3 blocks away and walked back in the rain. The kitchen was already humming when she clocked in at 6:15 a.m. The head chef, a man named Robert who had never spoken a word to her in 18 months, stood at the prep station slicing vegetables with mechanical precision. The sous chef, younger, maybe 30, glanced at her and looked away. No one said good morning. No one ever did. By 7:19 a.m. the servers were setting tables for lunch service. Mia moved between the dining room and kitchen, placing silverware exactly 1 inch from the plate's edge, folding napkins into geometric shapes, filling water glasses. Her hands knew this work the way a prayer knows its words, automatic, empty of thought, just the muscle memory of survival. At 1:11 p.m. Douglas Hale appeared in the service station with his phone in one hand and a coffee in the other. His hair was slicked back with something that smelled like chemicals, and his shirt, which probably cost more than her rent, was open 2 buttons too far. He was the kind of man who believed that proximity to money made him attractive. Morales. He said her name like it tasted bad. Come here. She came. This was what she had learned 8 years ago, when the bruises started, when a man said come, you came. You did not run. You did not hide. You made yourself small enough to disappear. The register was short yesterday, Douglas said. $140. That's coming out of your tips. Mr. Hale, I didn't. You saying I'm lying? His voice dropped to that particular register that meant danger. Because I got 3 other girls who'd kill for your shifts. 3. You want to argue with me, or you want to keep eating? She did not argue. She watched him slide a stack of bills, her tips, her rent, her food for the next 2 weeks, into his pocket. His thumbnail was painted with something that caught the light. He smiled at her with all his teeth showing. You're working tonight, he said. Off the books. Private event. Battery Street, basement level. You'll serve drinks. You'll keep your mouth shut. You'll make cash, which you probably need considering you smell like a car. He paused, letting that land. You'll be there at 8. Do not be late. He walked away. Through the dining room window, the rain was falling harder now. By afternoon the weather service was calling it a blizzard warning. Snow mixed with rain, wind picking up, visibility dropping. By 5 o'clock the roads were treacherous. At 5:44 p.m. Margaret Harrington swept into Sterling's, shaking snow from a coat that probably cost more than everything Mia owned, everything she had ever owned. Margaret Harrington was 62 years old and had the kind of face that money could buy but not character. Her diamond earrings caught the light like weapons. Behind her came 3 other women, wealthy, polished, the kind of women who ordered salads and complained they were too large. Mia was bussing tableful when Margaret snapped her fingers. Actually snapped. Like Mia was a dog who had been trained to respond to hand signals. You. Coffee. And this time, try not to look so desperate while you pour it. It ruins the ambience. The other women laughed. It was the kind of laughter that was directed at something small and helpless, laughter that was a weapon designed specifically to wound. Mia went to get the coffee. When she returned, Margaret was whispering something to her friends, and all of them turned to look at Mia with the exact same expression, pity mixed with disgust, the way you might look at a stain you noticed on the floor. Charity case, Mia heard Margaret say. Douglas keeps her around because she works for practically nothing. Probably homeless. I saw her getting out of some terrible car this morning. Can you imagine? Mia poured the coffee without spilling it. Her hands had become very steady. 8 years of surviving had taught her how to make her hands steady. How to make her face smooth. How to become the kind of person no one would notice, the kind of woman who was invisible because she had been taught, over and over, that invisibility was the price of safety. At 7:15 p.m. Douglas found her in the kitchen. The snow was coming down so hard now that it sounded like static against the windows. The restaurant had emptied, only 3 tables left, stragglers who were taking their time, trying to delay returning to the weather outside. You ready? Douglas asked. She was not ready. The roads were dangerous. Her car was barely functional. She had no idea what this poker game was, who would be there, what she was walking into. But she had $5 in her wallet and an eviction notice with 12 days marked in red ink, and Douglas Hale's face was already arranging itself into the expression that meant he was losing patience. Yes, she said. I'm ready. Good. Follow me to Battery Street. There's underground parking. Do not tell anyone where you're going. Do not mention this to the other servers. This is a private event for very important people. You keep quiet, you make good money. You talk, you'll never work in this city again. Understand? She understood. The rain was hammering the kitchen windows now. Outside, San Francisco was disappearing into white, the city turning into a blur of snow and darkness and cold. Mia went to get her coat. She thought about Emma, her daughter, 5 years old, staying tonight with the foster family that social services had placed her with 2 months ago, after the rent went unpaid and the landlord reported her as unfit. That was the particular pain of poverty. It did not only hurt the person living it. It reached through and took everything you loved. She thought about those 12 days marked in red ink. She thought about $5 in her pocket and a job that paid less than survival required. And then she went to follow Douglas Hale into the snow. The blizzard screamed against the windows of the underground poker room like something alive and furious. Snow had already piled 3 feet high on Battery Street above, but down here in the basement beneath the old warehouse, heat and cigar smoke created a completely different world. Mia Morales moved through that world like a ghost, invisible in her waitress uniform, refilling whiskey glasses and clearing ashtrays while 30 men in suits that cost more than everything she owned played cards under hanging lamps that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. She had $5 in her pocket. That was all. $5 and 12 days until the eviction notice became real, until the red ink deadline meant she and Emma would have nowhere to go except the shelter on Mission Street, where the bed smelled like mold and the night stretched endless and cold. Douglas Hale had promised good money for this private event. She hadn't asked questions. Questions meant losing the job, and losing the job meant losing everything faster. The elderly man at the corner table was losing faster. His name was Mr. Chen. He was 73 years old with hands that shook as he pushed his last chips forward, chips that represented his granddaughter's rent money, his medication fund, 12 years of careful savings. Mia watched the cards fall. Watched his face crumble. Watched the 3 enforcers in black shirts stand up in perfect synchronization, movements coordinated like a hunting pack that had practiced this ritual 100 times before. Mr. Chen, the lead enforcer, said, his voice flat and empty of mercy. You owe the house $35,000. Payment due in 7 days. Mr. Chen's voice cracked like old wood breaking under weight. Please. My granddaughter Emma, she's 6 years old, we got evicted last month, I thought maybe I could win it back, I thought. Should have thought of that before you sat down. The enforcer's hand moved to Mr. Chen's collar. Not rough, just inevitable. He pulled the old man toward the wall. The room, all 30 men, all the money, all the power concentrated in that single space, did not react. A card flipped. Someone drank whiskey. Someone else lit a cigar. This was business. This was how things worked. The strong took from the weak and the weak accepted it because they had no choice. Mia set down her tray. She walked toward 3 armed men twice her size. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, someone braver or more stupid. The lead enforcer glanced at her with genuine confusion, as if a ghost had interrupted his business. "Let him go," Mia said. The enforcer turned fully now, his hand still on Mr. Chen's collar. "What? He's 70 years old. You don't need to hurt him. Give him time to pay." Laughter rippled through the poker room like wind across water. The enforcer's face went blank, then his mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. His hand moved deliberately to the gun at his hip. "Little girl, you have no idea where you are or who you're talking to." "I know exactly where I am," Mia said, and her voice didn't shake even though her hands did. "And I know bullies when I see them." She raised her hand. The slap connected with his face so hard his head snapped sideways, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot in an enclosed space. For 1 full second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Cards froze mid-shuffle. Conversations died mid-sentence. 30 pairs of eyes locked on the nobody waitress in the worn uniform who had just struck an armed man in a room full of criminals. In the back corner booth, shrouded in shadow and cigar smoke, a man set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care. Luca Calabrese had been watching her since the moment she walked into the room. Not because she was beautiful, though she had the kind of bone structure that would have been striking if poverty hadn't carved it so thin. He watched her because she moved through the poker room like someone solving a math problem in her head, calculating, assessing, noticing things. She noticed when the elderly man's hand shook. She noticed when the enforcers stood. She noticed the eviction notice Mr. Chen had clutched in his weathered hand, 12 days marked in red ink, same as the notice that had cost her daughter. Luca had built an empire on reading people. On seeing what they wanted before they spoke it. On understanding the precise moment when fear transformed into something harder and more dangerous. He had learned this during childhood, watching his father lose everything to men who smiled while they took. He had perfected it after his brother's betrayal 8 years ago, a betrayal that had forced him to choose between mercy and survival. He chose survival. He had been choosing it ever since. But watching this woman step in front of 3 armed men to protect a stranger, watching her stand there with her entire body shaking while her voice stayed steady, something moved in his chest that he had believed was dead. His lieutenants Bruno and Pietro half rose from their seats, hands moving to weapons, waiting for the signal. Luca raised one finger, "Wait." The enforcer's face had gone purple with rage. His hand moved to his gun. He drew it with the casual confidence of someone who had never met resistance, never met anything that could not be solved by the simple fact of a weapon. "You just made the worst mistake of your pathetic life," he said. Mia didn't move. Her legs felt bolted to the floor. Every survival instinct screamed at her to apologize, to back away, to disappear back into invisibility. But Mr. Chen was 70 years old and his hands had been shaking, and somewhere a 6-year-old granddaughter was waiting for him to come home, and Mia had spent 8 years on the streets learning that there were only 2 kinds of people in the world, those who stood and those who stayed invisible while others fell. "I'd rather die homeless than let you hurt someone who can't fight back," she said. The enforcer's finger tightened on the trigger. The sound of it, that small metallic click, cut through the cigar smoke like a knife through fabric. Luca Calabrese stood. The room noticed immediately. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Men straightened in their chairs. The power in that room had a physical weight, and when Luca stood up, that weight shifted. He crossed the floor in 6 strides, footsteps silent on carpet. The 3 enforcers saw him coming and went absolutely pale. "Boss, we were just," the lead enforcer started. "Step back," Luca said. His voice was quiet. Absolute. 3 armed men retreated like scolded children. Luca looked at Mia Morales for the first time. Really looked. Took in the worn waitress uniform held together by careful sewing. The backpack at her feet containing everything she owned in the world. The way her hands trembled but her spine stayed straight. Her eyes, dark brown, exhausted, but alive in a way that spoke of survival against odds that should have broken her. He had seen 1,000 people beg for mercy. He had never seen someone defend a stranger while having nothing themselves. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mia. Mia Morales." "You know who I am, Mia?" She met his eyes, dark, dangerous, carrying the weight of 8 years of choices that could never be unmade. "No." "Should I?" Bruno and Pietro exchanged glances of pure shock. In 15 years of working for Luca Calabrese, they had never heard anyone speak to him with such directness. With no fear. With no calculation. Luca's mouth almost curved into a smile. Almost. "The old man's debt is forgiven," Luca said without looking away from her. "Someone get Mr. Chen home safely." Then to Mia, "You. Come with me." She should have said no. Every instinct that had kept her alive on the street screamed at her to refuse, to put distance between herself and this dangerous man. But her feet followed him anyway, toward the back room where leather furniture absorbed sound and a single lamp cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. Luca poured 2 whiskeys. Handed her one. The glass felt foreign in her hand, heavy with the weight of choices she hadn't made. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" "Blizzard's getting worse." "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Mia's fingers tightened on the glass. 8 years of practice told her to lie, to protect herself, to never let anyone know how close she was to the edge. But something in the way he was looking at her, with a kind of understanding that suggested he had been close to edges himself, made her tell the truth. "I sleep in my car. When it's too cold I go to the shelter on Mission Street. I wash up in gas station bathrooms. I have $5 in my pocket and that's all I have left in the world." "Is that what you wanted to hear?" The words came out harsh, defensive. Luca sat across from her with his elbows on his knees, and the scar along his jawline caught the lamplight. "Why did you step in?" "Because nobody else would. You could have been killed. Better than watching someone get hurt when I could have stopped it." Mia lifted the whiskey glass to her lips but didn't drink. "You didn't hurt Mr. Chen when you could have. You forgave his debt. That doesn't sound like someone to be afraid of." Something shifted in Luca's expression, recognition of something he used to be before his brother's betrayal taught him that mercy was weakness, that trust was dangerous, that the only survival strategy was control. "You're not afraid of me." "Should I be? Everyone else is." The basement door opened upstairs. Footsteps descended, multiple people, moving fast. Bruno appeared in the doorway, his face set in a particular expression that meant bad news had arrived. "Boss, we got a situation. Douglas Hale, the manager who brought her, has been skimming from the house take for 6 months. And Margaret Harrington's been using our poker nights to launder money through her husband's accounts. They're trying to leave. Blizzard's got the doors frozen shut. Nobody's going anywhere." Luca's jaw tightened. He stood, and Mia saw the man she had slapped the enforcer for glimpse away, replaced by someone colder. Someone who had built an empire on making problems disappear. "Let's go," he said. Mia followed him back into the poker room where Douglas Hale stood by the exit with sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, and Margaret Harrington sat rigid at a table, her diamond necklace catching the light like accusation. Both of them went white when they saw Luca emerge from the back with Mia Morales. Douglas recovered first, forced a laugh that came out strangled. "Luca, Mr. Calabrese, there's been a misunderstanding, I can explain." "You've been stealing from me for 6 months, Luca said, his voice conversational in a way that made it infinitely worse. "And you," he turned to Margaret, "you think I don't notice when money moves through my poker room into offshore accounts?" Margaret lifted her chin, defiance and calculation flickering across her face. You have no proof. I have 6 months of surveillance footage and 3 accountants who can trace every dollar. Douglas lunged. His hand grabbed Mia's arm hard enough to bruise, and when she tried to pull away, his grip tightened. Her sleeve rode up. For one terrible second, the scars on her wrist were visible, raised, pale, deliberately placed in careful rows. The room saw. Luca saw. His eyes went very dark. Very still. Let her go, he said. Douglas's grip tightened instead. She's nothing. A homeless bitch who... Luca moved. One moment he was across the room. The next his hand was around Douglas's throat, slamming him against the wall so hard the plaster cracked. You put your hands on her again, Luca said very quietly, and they'll never find your body. He released Douglas, who collapsed gasping and choking. Then Luca turned to Mia, and his voice gentled in a way that made Bruno and Pietro exchange stunned glances. In 15 years they had never heard him speak that way to anyone. How long? He asked. Mia pulled her sleeve down, chin raised. 8 years. But I survived. I'm still here. Who did this to you? Someone who doesn't matter anymore. Luca wanted to press, to demand names and vengeance. But he recognized the particular kind of steel in her spine, the kind forged in hell and tempered by survival. So instead he said, you need somewhere safe to stay until this blizzard clears. I have a penthouse. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Luca said. It's payment. You stood up for an old man when no one else would. You slapped an armed enforcer to protect a stranger. In my world, that kind of courage has value. Mia searched his face for mockery, manipulation, the hidden price that always came with gifts from powerful men. Found only careful sincerity. Why would you help me? I'm nobody. You're the woman who did what 30 men in this room didn't have the spine to do, Luca said. That's not nobody. But what neither of them knew was that Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington were already texting their connections, calling in favors, pulling strings, planning to destroy this homeless waitress who'd exposed them before she could testify to anyone who mattered. And what Luca didn't know was that Mia had survived 8 years by trusting no one, and every instinct screamed that getting close to this dangerous man would only end in more scars, more loss, more reasons to disappear. The blizzard continued to fall outside, burying San Francisco in white, sealing the poker room's occupants inside like people trapped in amber. The storm had only just begun. And the real danger was still hours away. The warehouse lights went dead at 4:36 in the afternoon. Red emergency floods kicked in, bathing everything in crimson like blood spreading across concrete. 12 federal agents in black tactical gear moved through the entrance in perfect formation, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, measured, unhurried, inevitable. Douglas Hale froze mid-step. Margaret Harrington's hand slipped from her phone. Special Agent Rodriguez stood in the center, badge raised, voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Douglas Hale, Margaret Harrington, you are under arrest for embezzlement totaling $2.3 million, money laundering through underground gambling operations, bribery of federal officers, and conspiracy to commit murder. Margaret's face drained of color. This is absurd. My lawyers will. Your lawyers are already in custody, Rodriguez said. We've had surveillance on both of you for 8 months. Financial records, wiretaps, video documentation of every transaction, every threat, every moment you discussed destroying a witness named Mia Morales. Douglas collapsed to his knees, trembling like a wounded animal backed into a corner with no escape. His voice came out broken, fractured. Please, please, I'll testify, she made me do it. Harrington planned everything, I was just following orders. Save your breath, a voice said from the warehouse entrance. Luca Calabrese stepped through the shadows, his charcoal coat worth more than Douglas Hale earned in 5 years. Bruno and Pietro flanked him, their expressions carved from stone. Behind them, news cameras flooded the space with harsh white light. Margaret stood, voice sharp as broken glass. You did this. You fed them everything. I told them the truth, Luca said. That you embezzled from poker operations. That you forged documents. That you filed false police reports to destroy an innocent woman. That you were going to have her killed to keep her silent. The cameras caught everything. Margaret Harrington in her $7,000 Valentino dress, diamonds catching light as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Her face twisted with rage and terror as federal agents read her rights. Douglas Hale sobbing, his suit rumpled, his dignity shattered like glass on concrete. Within 45 minutes, every news station in San Francisco ran the footage. By evening, national networks picked it up. The story spread like wildfire, wealthy restaurant owner and her associate arrested in federal takedown, facing 40 years in prison for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit murder. The alleged victim, the homeless woman named Mia Morales, had been living in her car 2 weeks ago. The videos racked up 2 million views in 6 hours. Back at Luca's penthouse, Mia stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, watching the sun bleed orange and gold across the San Francisco skyline. The television played on silent, Margaret Harrington's face cycling through news channels over and over. Arrested. Charged. Facing justice. The doorbell chimed at 6:15 p.m. Emma Chen stood in the hallway, clutching her grandfather's hand, both of them dusted with snow from outside. Emma carried a drawing, new one, crayon flowers in purple and yellow, stick figures holding hands. Her voice was small but certain. Grandpa said you saved him. I made you this. Mia knelt down, took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. Thank you, Emma. This is beautiful. Mommy says the bad people got caught. Are they going to prison? Yes, sweetheart. They are. Emma nodded with the simple logic of a 6-year-old. Good. Bad people should go to prison so they don't hurt anyone else. She paused, tilted her head. Will you stay now? Everyone always leaves. But I don't want you to leave. The words hit Mia like a prayer answered in the voice of a child who'd learned too early that good people sometimes disappeared from your life. Luca appeared in the hallway, dark suit immaculate, his presence filling the space the way gravity fills a room. He'd made 17 phone calls in the past hour. Arranged for Mia's arrest warrant to be formally withdrawn. Coordinated with federal agents. Ensured that every news outlet in the state knew she was a victim, not a criminal. His men were already arranging the next steps, new identity documents if she wanted them, education funding, a position with his legitimate businesses. But right now, he simply watched her kneel beside a 6-year-old girl and hold a crayon drawing like it was the most precious thing she'd ever received. Emma, your grandfather is waiting in the car, Luca said gently. Thank you for bringing the drawing. After they left, Mia turned to face him. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of the city below, traffic, sirens, the ordinary sounds of people going about their ordinary lives. They showed their mugshots on the news, she said quietly. 17 times in the last hour. Douglas Hale kept asking for his lawyer. Margaret Harrington wouldn't stop screaming. Federal charges carry a minimum 40-year sentence, Luca said. They'll spend their remaining years in a cell. That's not mercy. But it's justice. Mia wrapped her arms around herself. I was going to run. I left a letter on the bed. It said I was nobody. That I'd only drag you down. I found it. Luca moved closer, but not too close, giving her space to breathe. I want you to hear something. You stood in front of 30 armed men and chose to protect a stranger rather than save yourself. You could have walked away from Douglas Hale's abuse. You could have stayed invisible. Instead, you chose courage. I chose because I couldn't watch someone hurt people who couldn't fight back. Exactly. That's not nothing, Mia. That's everything. She looked at the drawing in her hands. Emma's crayon flowers in purple and yellow. Stick figures holding hands. A child's simple image of what family looks like. What happens now? Mia asked. That depends on you. I can set you up with a new life. Education, career, safety, everything you need. You could walk away from all of this, from me, from San Francisco, from everything connected to me. Clean slate. No strings. He paused. Or you could stay. Stay where? Here. In San Francisco. In this penthouse if you want. Build something. Build a life that isn't about running or hiding or surviving on $5 in your pocket and whatever scraps people throw away. Build something where you're not invisible. Where you matter. The rain started outside, tapping against the windows in a steady rhythm. San Francisco rain, soft and persistent, the kind that sounds like whispered promises. Mia thought about 8 years of running. Sleeping in cars. Washing her hair in gas station bathrooms. Counting pennies. Being looked through by people who saw her clothes instead of her spine. She thought about the moment in the poker room when Luca looked at her and recognized something unbreakable. She thought about Emma's drawing. About a child who didn't want her to leave. I'm tired of running, Mia whispered. Then stay. And in that moment, something shifted. The woman who'd arrived at this penthouse in borrowed clothes and terror began to transform into something different. Someone who wasn't defined by what she'd survived. Someone who'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's standing between fear and other people, shield them anyway. The news cycle moved on. By the next morning, the story had changed. Margaret Harrington's assets were frozen. Douglas Hale's restaurant was shut down pending investigation. Federal agents were still uncovering layers of corruption that went deeper than anyone had suspected. And Mia Morales was no longer running. She stood at the window as the sun rose over San Francisco, the rain-washed city glittering below her. Somewhere out there, Emma Chen was at school, maybe showing her teacher the drawing she'd made. Somewhere, Margaret Harrington sat in a federal holding cell, understanding finally what it meant to have her power stripped away. Somewhere, Douglas Hale was learning what 40 years looked like. But here, in this moment, Mia was simply standing in a place where someone had chosen to see her. Not as a victim. Not as a homeless woman. Not as nobody. As someone worth staying for. The city spread before her like a promise, messy and complicated and full of danger, but also full of people like Luca who could remember how to be gentle. People like Emma who could teach you what family meant. People like her who could stand between darkness and light and choose light, knowing the cost. Behind her, Luca was on the phone with his lawyers, untangling the last legal threads. Bruno and Pietro were coordinating with federal agents. The machinery of justice was still turning, still grinding away at the people who'd hurt her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Sometimes, Mia thought, one hand reached out at exactly the right moment can change an entire life. 6 months after the poker room, Mia Morales walked through the Mission Street shelter where she used to sleep on cold nights. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, the same tired hum she'd heard 1,000 times before, but this time she wasn't looking for a bed or a hot meal. This time she carried a stack of donation forms in her hands and a check signed by someone whose name she would never publicly speak. The shelter director, Ms. Rivera, looked up from her desk and froze. Recognition flickered across her face, not of Mia's identity, but of something changed about her. The way she stood. The way the light caught the edge of confidence she wore now like borrowed clothes becoming her own. Mia? Ms. Rivera stood slowly. You came back. I came back to help, Mia said quietly. Her voice no longer trembled like a candle in the wind. It held weight now, like someone who'd learned to trust her own words. These are donations. For beds, for meals, for job training. For people like I was. People who need a way out that doesn't require choosing between safety and dignity. Ms. Rivera took the check and her eyes went wide. $40,000. Tears started immediately. This will change so many lives. Whoever your donor is. Someone who understands what it's like to need a second chance. That was all Mia said. She didn't mention Luca. Didn't mention the mafia connections that had been quietly liquidated into legitimate foundations. Didn't mention that the man who controlled half of San Francisco's underworld had redirected his empire toward redemption. Some stories were too dangerous to tell. Some kindness was best delivered like rain, nobody needed to know which cloud carried it. Outside, the November evening had turned crisp, the city settling into dusk. Luca waited in the car, a black sedan with tinted windows, understated and expensive like everything about him. When Mia slid into the passenger seat, he reached over and squeezed her hand. No words needed. They'd learned each other's silences over these 6 months. They'd learned how to sit together without falling into the old patterns of needing to fill every empty space with proof of affection. "You know you don't have to keep doing this anonymously," he said as the car pulled into traffic. The engine purred like something dangerous held perfectly still. "You could take credit. Let people know what you're building." Mia watched the city slide past the window, Sterling's fine dining now under new management, the old sign painted over, the old manager Douglas Hale 3,000 miles away in a federal penitentiary in Florida serving 40 years for racketeering, embezzlement, and conspiracy. She thought of how he used to steal her tips. How he'd made her work doubles without overtime pay. How he'd humiliated her in front of customers while Margaret Harrington watched and smiled. Margaret Harrington, who now sat in a women's facility in the same state, her socialite friends refusing her calls, her estate seized, her reputation scattered like ashes. Justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like release, the kind that came from knowing you didn't have to carry their weight anymore. "I don't need credit," Mia said. "I just need them to have what I didn't." A way out. They drove past the courthouse where Margaret Harrington had been sentenced, led away still screaming about injustice while her victims watched in silence. Past the corner where Mia used to wash up in gas station bathrooms in the grey light of dawn, invisible and alone. Past the parking garage where 8 men in black suits had quietly arrested Douglas Hale at gunpoint, federal agents moving with the precision of a choreographed nightmare. The penthouse overlooked the bay. Their penthouse now, though Mia still sometimes caught herself thinking of it as his. The view stretched across the water where lights began to glow as the sun disappeared. Emma Chen's latest drawing hung on the refrigerator, a family portrait rendered in crayon colors, tall figure with dark hair, shorter woman with long dark hair, a small girl between them, an elderly man beside them all. Everyone holding hands. The title, written in Emma's careful printing, "My Family." Emma had started calling Mia Mama 3 months ago. It had happened quietly, without announcement. They'd been making cookies and Emma had said, "Mama, is the flour supposed to be lumpy?" And Mia had frozen, her hands covered in flour and grief and joy so profound it cracked something open in her chest. She'd looked at Luca and his eyes had glistened. That was the night he'd held her while she cried, not from trauma but from relief. From the understanding that someone had chosen to stay. That a child had chosen to see her as family. That broken things could be reassembled into something stronger than before. "Come here," Luca said now. They stood at the window as the city darkened into night. He came behind her, arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He was a man who touched her carefully, who'd learned that gentleness required intention. His men watched this transformation with shock that never quite faded. In the weeks after the poker room, after the federal arrests, after the fallout, Bruno had pulled Mia aside and said quietly, "In 15 years of working for him, I have never seen him sit next to someone like this. Like she was precious. Like losing her would actually hurt." "You changed my life," Mia said, watching the bay lights multiply like someone scattering diamonds. "That night in the poker room, I was ready to die defending a stranger because I had nothing left to lose. And you saw that moment and decided I was worth saving. You saved yourself. You made the choice to stand up. I just made sure you didn't have to keep fighting alone." His voice was steady, like thunder you could trust. Like someone who'd learned that strength didn't require constant performance. "We saved each other." The rain came then, soft at first, then heavier. Mia could hear it on the windows, on the balcony railing, the sound of San Francisco being washed clean. They didn't move. They just stood there watching the water streak the glass, their reflections ghostly and close. Do you remember that night in the poker room? He asked. Before everything happened? Every second. I was in the corner, supposed to be evaluating Douglas Hale's proposal for expanding his operation into my territory. Business arrangement between corrupt men. And then you walked in following him, carrying coffee with your hands shaking. He paused. And I watched you stand between 3 armed men and someone who couldn't protect himself when you had $5 to your name. I didn't think about the cost. I was already bankrupt. That's the difference between people who matter and people who don't. The ones who matter don't calculate the cost of doing what's right. They just do it. His arms tightened around her. You mattered before I ever saw you. I just made you visible again. The knock on the door came unexpected. Emma Chen's voice calling out, high and bright and joyful, "We're here. Grandpa made a cake." Mia turned to Luca, and he smiled, a real smile, the kind his men never saw, the kind that made him look younger somehow, like someone who'd remembered how to want things other than power. The old man came through the door first, Emma's grandfather, Mr. Chen, whose eviction notice Luca had quietly erased by purchasing the entire building and installing him in a rent-free apartment on the top floor. Behind him bounded Emma, 7 years old now, her school uniform still on, her hair coming loose from its ribbons. "I finished my project about heroes," Emma announced breathlessly, skidding to a stop at Mia's knees. "And I wrote about you. About how you saved Grandpa even though you were scared." Mia's throat tightened. She knelt down to eye level, and Emma wrapped her arms around her neck with the fierceness of a child who'd learned what loss felt like and was determined never to take safety for granted again. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Mia said, her voice barely holding. "It means you're scared but you do what's right anyway." "That's what Grandpa says you taught him," Emma whispered back. "That's why he doesn't work for bad people anymore." The cake said family in shaky frosting letters. Mr. Chen had made it himself, his hand still trembling sometimes from the stress of those months when his debt had loomed like a sentence, when Margaret Harrington had threatened legal action to take his apartment, when everything he'd built had been one signature away from collapse. Luca had stopped all of that with a single phone call. A phone call and a choice to protect instead of destroy. They sat around the dining table as the rain continued outside, a sound like the entire city breathing with them. Emma talked about her school day, about her teacher, about how she was learning to paint. Mia watched her, this small girl who taught her what family meant, what it felt like to be chosen, what it meant to have someone look at you without calculating your usefulness or your cost. "Mama," Emma said between bites of cake, "why do you always wear short sleeves now?" The question came the way children's questions do, directly, without performance. Mia's scars were visible on her forearms, thin white lines running in several directions like a map of survival drawn in pain. She'd stopped hiding them 3 months ago. The first time she'd worn a sleeveless dress, Luca had traced each scar gently with his fingertip, and she'd watched him understand, really understand, what she'd survived. "Because they're part of my story," Mia said. "And my story is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. I survived. I fought back. I got out." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "Colors for sad days. When you feel sad, I can look at them and remember you're brave." "You're very wise for 7 years old," Mia said, and Emma smiled like that was the greatest compliment in the world. Later, after they'd left, after Mr. Chen had hugged both of them and Emma had made Mia promise to come to her school play, after the city had settled into the deep night of November, Mia found the letter. She'd kept it for 6 months, stored in a drawer beneath old photographs. The letter she'd written intending to disappear, to run, to remove herself from Luca's life before she could destroy it. She pulled it out and handed it to him wordlessly. They stood on the balcony overlooking the sleeping city, rain still falling in light sheets, and he read it by the glow of the city lights. His expression shifted as his eyes moved across the words written by someone so desperate, so convinced that her only kindness was her absence, that she'd been willing to die rather than be burden. When he finished, he folded it carefully and pulled her against him. "You're not running. You're not disappearing. You're here. With me." For as long as you want to be. What if I want forever? Then forever it is. The rain continued. The city breathed around them. And Mia understood finally what it meant to be saved, not by strength, not by power, but by someone seeing you in your lowest moment and deciding you were worth the cost of staying. Worth the risk. Worth the choice to protect instead of destroy. Sometimes one hand reached out at the right moment can change an entire life. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like and share this video with the people you love. Every comment you leave is a precious source of motivation. We wish all of you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace.